Good evening, Fiji, and welcome to For the Record. Now, this evening, we'll talk about an issue I'm sure many of us have been talking a lot about in the last month or so, ever since its announcement. Yes, the national minimum wage. And here to clarify a little bit more about this issue, and he's taken enough time, and we want to thank him for that, the Minister for Labour and Industrial Relations and Employment, Mr. Tony Musumati. A very good evening to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening to you, too.
Thank you again for taking time for coming to the show this evening. Now, I'm going to ask you first, 2 years as the Minister for Labour, what has it been like?
Well, it's been, I think it's been very exciting. At first, it was very educational also for me, and it's a great experience to be able to have working in an organization previously, you're focused on the role of the organization. But as minister, you need to look at the needs of the whole of the country. And working in an organization, you make when you make a decision, it has an impact on that organization. But here as a minister, when you make a decision, when you're able to change a law, it has an impact on the whole country, and it has an impact not just for today, to future generations. So it's a huge responsibility, but it's something that I've appreciated and look forward to.
Quite daunting, but I'm told that you are the man for it. Before this, you were involved in, well, a similar an organization that dealt with these issues.
Well, largely my organization, just before coming to this job, I was at the Fiji National University, looking after technical vocational education and training, looking at the quality of that, the quality assurance of all the programs in the university, making sure that when they designed the program, it met its initial need.
Okay.
But before that, I was looking at training and productivity. So my background has been training and productivity. So labor relations is something that is integral and it's fundamental to when you talk about productivity. So it's all been related to some degree.
Well, speaking of which, let's jump right to the issue. The national minimum wage. Now, the recommendation by the independent consultant, Dr. Mahendra Reddy, had suggested that it be $2.30 or so, right? And the recommendation to government that has now been passed is $2 minimum wage. A lot of our listeners on our various radio stations on the Fiji Broadcasting Corporation, last week, yourself and the various officers took to the airwaves and explained a little bit of these and clarified the issue. Now, still, there seems some misconceptions of this, especially the number, $2. Now, would you care to just clarify just a little bit?
Okay. The national minimum wage, its intent is to focus on those at the very lowest levels of earning in our society. Now, in government, we have already set up minimum wages in 10 different sectors. For instance, in the printing trades, the manufacturing trades, wholesale and retail, security, sawmilling and logging, all of these areas. We have already set minimum wages. So, for instance, in the security industry, we have already set a minimum wage for that industry, $2.41 per hour. So we have set up minimum wages in 10 different sectors. But there are a lot of people in Fiji who fall outside the scope of these 10 sectors. Right? So that what we needed to do, we set the minimum wages in 10 sectors, but for the people who fall outside of this, we need to then set a minimum wage that captures everybody else. But when you capture everybody else, you're not only capturing people in the formal sector, working for companies, you also need to capture people in the informal sector. For instance, people working in a car wash, people working in the agricultural sector. In other words, those who are the lowest paid. So when you set a minimum wage, a national minimum wage that covers everybody else, you have to have two things in mind. One, you must try to raise their wage levels to a level that is better for them, that they have more money to take home. At the same time, it's absolutely critical that when you set that minimum wage, it does not lead to job losses at the very lower end. So when you're setting a national minimum wage, there's a fine balance. It's like walking a tightrope. Eh? I know the initial recommendation was for a wage of $2.32. I thought that would work for the formal sector. But then when we looked at the needs of the informal sector, those at the very lowest end, and when we did our survey, we found out, for instance, that the average wage in the agricultural sector is around $52 per week. $52 per week. Now, when we set our minimum wage at $2 per hour, that means that in that sector, the wage would go from $52 to $90. Now, people have said, okay, why don't you raise it up to $4? I've seen this in the media. But if you raise the wage too high, what does that mean? It means that at the lower end, there is a high possibility, not in the formal sector, especially in the informal sector, that people will say, I can't afford this wage. I'm shutting down. You guys who are working for me now for $1 per hour, $1.20, you go home. What happens to them and their families? This is the problem. This is the dilemma that we face. Yes, we want to raise everybody's wage, but we must do it in such a manner that people's employment is not at risk. So at the end of the day, that's why we've decided $2 now. In a year's time, we will reassess the impact of all of this, and we'll see. When we do the review, it might go up, it might stay the same, who knows? Or that will only know after we've done the assessment in a year's time.
So 1 year's time, that will be reassessed?
That will be
reassessed. Will that include the 10 other sectors?
The 10 other sectors, I've asked my staff to do that work this year. The existing sectoral minimum wages have been in place now for 2 years, 2012. I think they came into place in 2012, 2013, 2014. This year, we will be reviewing those sectoral minimum wages, all the 10.
All 10?
All 10.
Now, these will include the hospitality industry?
Yes. Hospitality, as I said, security, manufacturing, I've got a list somewhere in there. So all of those will be reviewed this year.
Okay. Well, good news for them because, well, what kind of review, like you're going in with your labor officers, are they conducting it within each of the organizations? Have they been?
No. Yeah? Previously, we've had a wages council. So we had one wages council for the security service, one for all of these. What we're looking at in our new legislation that we're looking to put in place is to have a wages forum that looks at all of these sectors. Okay. And then as you look at each sector, then you can call in people who are specialists in that sector to give you advice on that sector. But at the same time, we need to carry out surveys. We've got our own staff that can do that and others to get actual data from the ground on how much people are being paid.
So that's when you're going to be talking to the workers themselves?
Yes, that's even for this survey, when we established this national minimum wage survey, we surveyed 10,000 workers across this country. 10,000 workers, in Viti level and Wuno level. We're very thankful to Dr. Mahendra Reddy from the Fiji National University, who was our consultant, and he gave us the design for all the mechanisms. Our people went out and collected 10,000 data from 10,000 people.
Both in informal and formal sector.
Both in informal and informal sector. And as a result of that, we've got a whole lot of data on this. So it has given us a good grounding on setting up the national minimum wage. When we do the revision of the minimum wage for each of the sectors, we'll have to go back and have surveys to using our own staff or other means to make sure that we have a good understanding of what the conditions are. In the past, I think that when they were looking at revising minimum wages, there was just a lot of discussion. It was not based on data and information. If you have not measured it, you can't really manage.
You can't really make a decision. Yeah.
So that's what we hope to improve on this year.
All right. We'll continue with this very interesting discussion right after this short break. Welcome back to For the Record, and with us this evening, well, talking about the national minimum wage, and just before the break, clarified there that the $2 national minimum wage has been set, and it is set at $2, and this will be reviewed in a year's time.
That's correct.
And now, we talked about the informal and the formal sector now, 10 different divisions. Now, these divisions, could we just have a look at the minimum wage for each division?
Okay, for instance, we have like in the printing trades. In the printing trades, we have a minimum wage there for people who are learners in that trade. It's set at $2.61, and for other workers at $3.15. For people that are in the wholesale and retail trade, we have a whole set of minimum wages, like for cashiers, $2.97, clerks, $2.97, watchmen, $2.73, storemen, $2.97. Okay. So we have a whole range for different occupations for this sector. In the hotel and catering trade, we have the same thing. We have, for watchmen, it's $2.97 or $2.93. For clerks, for general workers, house workers, things are ranging from $2.70 to $2.90 and so forth. So there's a range of wages established. And it goes through for the garment industry, learners at $1.81, others at $2.15, sawmilling and logging industry, road transport, building and civil, all of these. So there are, in some of these sectors, there's just one wage set. In others, for different occupation types, minimum wages have been set. And there are other things that are set, conditions for overtime, the total hours of work, sick leave, annual leave, meal allowance, subsistence allowance. These are all covered in these sectoral allowance. Okay. So this national minimum wage is not going to impact on those. Those ones will still be in place. Right. But those sectoral minimum wage, they'll be reviewed this year.
This year.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, looking at, with the ministry also are now closely monitoring these organizations and companies at these, with accordance to whether they're complying to these rates?
Well, one of the findings that we had from the survey that we carried out, that the level of compliance in some cases was not very good. In some sectors, from those that we interviewed on the streets, compliance was maybe 29% were not in compliance, or 30% or 15%. So what we went back and asked Cabinet to do is to allow us to have more people on our staff to go out and have inspections. So this year they've given us more money, we've taken on more staff, and the idea for our viewpoint now is not wait for the complaints to come, but get our more staff on, give them set targets of the number of organizations they have to visit every month, so we can go out, we can have more inspections, we can address the complaints before they come to us. The way that we address complaints is to make sure our staff go in, do the inspections, understand what the areas are, where there are problems, and deal with that directly with the company so that the complaints do not come to us.
To be very honest, this is most of these companies that do not adhere to these rules don't know.
Don't know about
the rates, yeah? Or do not know sometimes, yeah?
I think a lot of them know, because it's required for them under the legislation that if you are in this sector, you have to post these rates up. So for
those who claim that they didn't know,
well, it's a requirement.
It's a requirement.
It's a requirement. I think so. These things, there's a balance. On one part, on the part of the Ministry of Labour, we try to uplift, so through social justice, what workers, things that workers need. There is a moral obligation and an ethical responsibility also on all employers to make sure that they do the right thing by their workers. Because I receive lots of complaints, very, very funny things that happen. Things like, getting workers to clock out and then continue working and then pay them wages cash after that. Those kinds of things are completely unethical. They need to be put a stop to. When you do that, when you pay cash, that means FNPF is not paid on those overtime. These kinds of practices need to be we need to put a stop to it. So what the ministry is trying to do, we're not trying to raise the wages too much, because we know you should not kill the goose that lays the golden egg, which is the employers that bring wealth into this country. At the same time, there's a moral and ethical responsibility on employers to do the right thing. It doesn't mean that we set a minimum wage of $2 or $2.41 that you bring your wages down. If you can afford to, you must give more to our people, because they are the people who add value to our organizations.
Now, with the increase of staff that you have, will you have more labor enforcement
Yes,
officers?
we will be having more labor inspectors out in all of our centers. We have centers here in Suva, Singatoka, Nandi, Lotoka, Mba, Lambaso, all over. So all of these people will be going out, and hopefully we should try to meet as many employees as possible. We have changed our performance management system, giving these people very set targets on how many employees they must meet every month, how many they must go inspect every week, so that we are going out rather than waiting for problems to come to us.
What about complaints? You mentioned the complaints and compensation claims. How many would you be able roughly to...
Compensation
for, like, say, for those who have been probably not received the pay that they ought to have?
Oh, I don't have the actual numbers. Okay. Because I didn't prepare myself.
But has there been a lot of...
Yes, there have been. There are complaints about annual leave, there are complaints about maternity pay not being paid, or allowances, or wages being cut, or unfair dismissal. All of these things happen. The good thing with the current government right now, previously if you had an issue like that, only your union could bring it to the ministry.
Right. Yes.
But once the laws changed in 2008, every single worker in this country, if they have a grievance, except those that are covered by the public service, government workers, and those covered by the essential national industries decree, everybody else, they can come directly to the Ministry of Labour and raise their issue, raise their complaint, and we have mechanisms to try to address it.
Okay. Right. Well, we're also looking at OHS compliance. Yeah? This has been something that is also good about the the labor decree. Yeah? How many companies, I mean, roughly, would you say, has it been good?
I think
has companies been behaving?
Okay. Well, Well, there are the good companies that do things well, and there are always those, that try to be a bit dodgy and so forth. But overall, OHS has been performing much better because they've been going out very proactively in inspections in the past. But there are always those that try to play around. But underneath this OHS and this labor laws, there's one primary fundamental principle there, is that the first step in OHS and labor laws is to get the parties that are involved to self-regulate themselves. That's why in the OHS, we have the OHS committees in-house. These committees have representatives from management and workers, and problems they should try to resolve
right there.
When it fails there, then it comes up to us. We have the same sort of mechanism for labor laws. It's called the LMCC.
Right.
There are problems with the other company, they try to resolve it there. There's an emphasis here on self-regulation. Regulate yourselves. When it fails, then you come to the ministry. So as I said, we need to build good faith between workers and their management. A fundamental of this thing is good faith employment relationships. You build good relationships, OHS improves, labor relations improve, productivity is going to go up. And when productivity goes up, we have more wealth to be shared out amongst our people, better roads, hospitals, all of these things become much better.
How successful has that been, the LMCC? And
LMCC, I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that area. We know we have been registered, we've been doing the training. I've asked my ministry to go out very strongly to try to assist companies to put in this much stronger. Because if you have an LMCC, it demonstrates that there's more good faith between the workers and management. They respect each other, they see themselves as not as protagonists, but as mutual partners to grow the company, grow the pie, so that they have more for both parties.
Like a family.
Like a family, yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
Well, we'll continue this interesting discussion right after this short break on For the Record. Welcome back, Fiji, to For the Record, and we continue our discussion with the Minister for Labour, Industrial Relations and Employment, Mr. Chonyo Sumate, this evening. Now, on FBC News, we had showed on Friday evening a story regarding a Lamy factory in the capital, Suva, that had been somehow, the certain conditions in the factory were not conducive to the workers, and they brought the attention to us. And they were producing shoes. It's a shoe company, but were operating under the auspices of a garment factory. They were paying their workers $2.15. Now, for a manufacturing company, how much should they be paid?
Well, in the minimum wages that we have for the garment industry is $2.15, and for a learner is $1.81. But for the manufacturing industry, it's $3.02 per hour. That is to be paid for. Those are the minimum wages that in each of these sectors.
Okay, so already that's the conditions also for the workers. They didn't have any proper footwear, no masks. These standards are supposed to be enforced by the companies that are manufacturing something like shoes. Yeah?
There are regulations for these things in terms of personal protection equipment that people should have. I don't have the full details of these things. But there are minimum conditions that need to be met, and when we become aware of organizations not meeting that, see, that's one of the reasons that you should have the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, so that things are brought to a surface and are discussed. But where companies refuse to provide these things, they need to be brought to our attention, so our officers can come in and assist the company to raise the safety of the workers.
So these companies, this includes manufacturing companies, garment factories, should also have OHS committees?
All organizations, all workplaces that have at least 20 workers, they must have an Occupational Health and Safety Committee.
LMCC?
LMCC, I think the same thing applies. If you have more than 20 workers, you must have an LMCC.
And this will be, training will be provided by the company with the assistance of the Ministry of Labor?
Yes, I think there's a requirement for the members of the OHS committees to be trained so they understand the responsibility, and also for the LMCC members.
Right.
If you have the whole theory behind the whole thinking behind the legislation, if you have an OHS committee working well, and an LMCC committee working well, a lot of the issues will be addressed at that level.
Right.
And now those who run the organizations need to pay a lot of cognizance to the things that take place in these committees. If the organization needs to have the welfare of its people too at heart.
Always at heart, yeah.
So that you have a balance between, profit is not a bad thing, profit is a great thing. Profit is the way the world grows.
But if your workers are not happy.
Yeah, but at the same time, the needs of the workers, the rights of the workers, the obligations of the workers, you must never play second fiddle to that. The government, it needs to be balanced. That's why when I talk about the national minimum wage, we're trying to set it at a level that is a balance to making sure that small employers don't just filter away and die, but at the same time you try to raise the level of earning for the people that are working in those organizations. So there always has to be a balance. It's good for companies to make a lot of money, but they must not forget the key way in which they add value to all of their activities, which is their people.
What happens to companies that violate measures?
If companies violate and our workers go in, we try to give them improvement notices for them to improve. But if they continue, then there are fines and all kinds of things in our legislation that we need to be brought in. So first of all, we'll try to teach them to make sure that they comply with our rules and our regulations. If they continue to, to blatantly disregard these things, then the axe has to fall. It's like when you look for a fire, you see the stove is red hot. You know, I'm going to touch that stove, I'm going to get burnt. If you keep on, you see that you're going to get burnt, you reach out your hand to touch it, you will get burnt.
Okay. Now, for the record, that particular company was also the complaint was brought to your attention. Now, is it? Can you confirm that labor officers have?
Yeah, I believe the officers have gone. I have not received feedback from them on what has happened. That is something that I'll probably learn next week.
Okay. Now, the other issue of wages that a lot have been asking is, okay, when companies do not comply to these various sectors, to the minimum wage, now their complaints can be brought. How long does it take? How long does the process take?
Well, the process, when companies are not complying, our officers will go and discuss it with some of these companies. A lot of these companies, when there's a discussion, when they can agree on the records and so forth, some of them are willing to pay. Okay. So a lot of it is dependent too on the company's willingness to do what is right. In some cases, they argue about it, then there's a process that we go through. If their officers can't sort it out and both agree with it, our labor officers, then it goes to the next step, which is mediation, where there's a mediation between the two parties. A mediator is a person who is brought in to try to get the two parties to agree to a solution. And a lot of cases are solved at the mediation, about 75%. Those that cannot be solved there, then we take it to the tribunal. Now, the mediator is a person that brings the two parties together to try to get them to agree to a solution. The tribunal is a person who imposes a decision. He looks at both parties and tries to then impose a decision. And if thing fails there, they can go to the Employment Relations Court. But we try to, if we have good faith employment relations, then the thing should be solved between at the company level, if not between our labor officers who are looking at these matters, and ultimately at the mediation. But if it fails there, we have another mechanism. When it reaches the tribunal, then it takes a long time. But we hope that things can be settled at the lower level.
Because at the lower level is where, it's closer to get your discussions. Yeah. Okay, with the next, year or so, what are your plans for 2014?
Well, I think, not 2014, one of the things that I'm glad that we've been able to do this year, when I first came into this job and I looked at what we had in terms of the People's Charter and its various things that it needed to do, what I realized that the best way to address that is to change the laws. If you want to raise the level of service to achieve the kinds of things that we have in the Charter and the Constitution, rather than just running around within the existing systems that you have, you change this system. You change what is written there. And that has been the practice in my ministry, something that they had already started before I came. So this year, last year, over the past 2 years, they've revised the Employment Relations Promulgation. So the whole labor legislation that covers most workers has been changed. That's going to be implemented. So that is one of the major things that I'm very happy that we've been able to do it within my ministry, not using external consultants, done by our own people, but in fantastic partnership that we've had with representatives of workers, the trade unions, and government. Sitting together, more than 30 plus, maybe 35, 36, 39 meetings over the past 2 years to develop a new legislation, a revised legislation through social dialogue. That's been one of our great achievements. This year, we hope to be able to implement all of these, to be able to finalize our reform on the workmen's compensation,
Right.
which is the last reform that we need to be able to do, get that out of the way, and also, in general, improve our level of service, reduce the number of problems that we have at the tribunal in terms of the cases that are there. We are getting additional tribunals in place so that the decisions can be made faster and problems can be resolved faster. This year we are putting in more people as our labor inspectors, so less problems will come to us, more will be solved at the workplace. And there's an emphasis on customer service and service excellence. That's what we're focusing on.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, the customer service, because we discussed that a lot too on our radio shows here at Fiji Broadcasting Corporation. Unfortunately, Mr. Sumate, this is all the time that we have for. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. And you can join us again next week on another version of For the Record. If you've got comments or questions, please send them to fortherecord@fbc.com.fj. I welcome you to join me again next week on more discussion on pertinent issues to all Fijians. Good night, Fiji.